This story is about The Rain Never Stops. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. Staying at an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere sounded perfect, until the nightmare began. From the moment I arrived, the rain was relentless, creating an eerie ambiance that felt like it was pulled straight from a horror story. The house was quaint and isolated, perfect for a quiet weekend home alone. The rain sounds tapped steadily against the windows, but beneath them there was something else, a sense of dread that would soon reveal itself. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside the house was the smell. Musty, like the place hadn't been lived in for a long time. I had read plenty of Airbnb reviews, but none mentioned anything strange about the property. The rain poured down in sheets, creating a steady rhythm against the roof, but the silence inside the house was heavy. I brushed off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was just the rain, the isolation, and maybe a bit of exhaustion from the drive. But that night, I heard it. A loud thud upstairs while I was lying in bed, wide awake. The sound was unmistakable. Something heavy had hit the floor. I sat up, straining to listen. I told myself it was nothing, that it had to be the house settling. After all, old houses make noises. But the thought wouldn't leave me. I had heard horror stories about haunted houses, but I never believed them. The footsteps that followed, faint but unmistakable, felt real. I was home alone, and it didn't make sense. Was it a prank? Someone hiding in the house, waiting for me? Or something worse? A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the countless ghost stories I'd seen online. Creepypastas on Reddit, animated horror stories on YouTube, and those caught-on-camera paranormal videos that gave me chills. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But as the footsteps drew closer, my skepticism faded. I wanted to get up, to check if someone was there, but fear kept me glued to the bed. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for whatever was making that sound to reveal itself. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. The only thing I could hear now was the rain. But even that had turned ominous, each drop against the window sounding like a warning. I tried to rationalize what had happened, but the anxiety kept building. It wasn't just the house creaking, it wasn't just the rain, something was wrong. The next morning, the rain hadn't stopped. It fell harder, almost angrily, pounding the roof in relentless waves. I tried to shake off the events of the night as just an overactive imagination. I had spent too much time watching scary videos online, too many ghost hunting shows, too many Reddit threads about real-life paranormal experiences. I was letting all those horror stories get to my head. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. But as I walked through the house that day, I couldn't ignore the heavy atmosphere. The air felt dense, oppressive. I checked every room, looking for any signs of an intruder, but everything was in place. No doors had been tampered with, no windows were open. The house was empty, yet it felt occupied. I opened my laptop, thinking about looking up some true horror stories or ghost hunting tips, something to ease my nerves. But instead, I found myself scrolling through Airbnb reviews, looking for any mention of strange occurrences at this property. That evening, as the storm raged on, the house grew colder. I put on an extra layer, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rain sounds that had been so calming when I first arrived were now unsettling. Every drop felt like a countdown to something worse. My thoughts drifted back to the stories I had heard as a kid, about haunted houses and demons lurking in the shadows. I had never believed in any of it, until now. The footsteps returned that night, louder and more insistent. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They continued into my room, slow and deliberate. I could feel the presence, cold and malevolent, though I couldn't see it. My heart raced as I clutched the covers, praying that whatever it was would leave, but it didn't. I could hear it breathing, low and raspy, just inches away. I shut my eyes tight, too terrified to move, too afraid to confront what might be standing right next to me. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was empty. The footsteps were gone, but the terror remained. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The house was quiet again, but I knew that the quiet wouldn't last. The next morning, I was determined to leave. I packed my things quickly, eager to get out before nightfall. But as I reached for the front door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My reflection in the window wasn't my own. It was distorted, twisted, as if something had taken my place. I stepped back in shock, but the image stayed, grinning at me with a mouthful of jagged teeth. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but it was dead. No signal, no Wi-Fi. The house was cutting me off from the outside world. I ran upstairs, hoping to find another way out, but the windows wouldn't open. The rain was now a torrential downpour, trapping me inside. I had no choice but to wait it out. That night, the footsteps returned, more menacing than before. They weren't just footsteps anymore. They were heavy, dragging sounds, like something was crawling towards me. I sat in bed, frozen with fear as the sounds grew louder, closer. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched and misshapen, standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its breath came out in ragged gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if the house itself was holding me in place, forcing me to face the horror that had been lurking in the shadows. The figure leaned in closer, its face inches from mine. I could smell its rotting breath, feel its cold fingers brushing against my skin, and then everything went black. I woke up the next morning on the floor, drenched in sweat. The rain had stopped, and the house was eerily quiet. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bags and ran out the door without looking back. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't done with me. But I was done with it. I barely escaped, but I knew that the next person who stayed there might not be so lucky. This story is about the unwelcome guest. I booked the Airbnb with high hopes of getting some work done in peace. The photos online showed a charming old farmhouse, surrounded by open fields, with a serene view of the mountains. The reviews were glowing, full of people praising the house's tranquility. What no one mentioned, however, was the overwhelming sense of dread that would come with staying there. I thought I was just being paranoid until I realized I was not alone. The first night was uneventful. I arrived late, around 9 p.m., to the sound of wind howling through the trees. I set my bags down, started a fire in the wood stove, and unpacked my laptop to catch up on some work. The rain started just as I was about to settle in for the night, a steady tapping on the roof. It wasn't long before the soft rhythm of rain sounds lulled me to sleep. But something woke me up in the middle of the night, something far more disturbing than the wind or rain. At 2:33 a.m., I shot out of bed, heart pounding. I had heard it, something crashing downstairs. My immediate thought was that someone had broken in. I hesitated before getting out of bed, listening carefully. The house creaked, but there were no footsteps. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping downstairs slowly. But when I reached the living room, everything was exactly as I had left it. The fire had died down, leaving nothing but embers. I convinced myself that it must have been something falling over outside, a branch perhaps, and went back to bed. That was my first mistake. The next morning, I felt uneasy. There was something wrong with the house. I tried to shake it off as nerves. It was an old house, after all. I brushed off the night before, telling myself I had imagined the sound, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I made breakfast, I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see someone staring back at me, but no one was there. Still, the sensation of not being alone persisted. I decided to take a walk in the fields to clear my head. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a misty atmosphere that felt like it belonged in a horror movie. I couldn't help but think about all the creepy stories I had read online, the true horror stories people shared about their haunted Airbnb stays. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just paranoia. Something was very wrong. That night, as the rain returned, the house seemed to come alive with sounds. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house I could hear soft, barely audible footsteps. I stayed up late, trying to distract myself with scary videos on YouTube, hoping they would make the noises seem less real, more like the plot of an animated horror story. But as midnight approached, the footsteps grew louder. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was inside the house with me. I thought back to all the ghost stories I had heard growing up, tales of haunted houses where people were tormented by spirits that refused to leave. At that moment, I realized I was living one of those horror stories. But this wasn't some animated tale or a chilling video I could turn off. This was real. I decided to confront whatever it was. Grabbing the fireplace poker, I cautiously made my way to the hallway. The rain was louder now, pounding on the windows, and the house groaned as if it were protesting my every step. I reached the top of the stairs, my heart racing. That's when I saw it. Just for a split second, a shadow darting across the landing. I froze, my mind racing. I had read too many ghost hunting stories not to recognize what was happening. I was in a haunted house, and whatever spirit lived here didn't want me staying overnight. I turned on every light in the house, hoping it would drive away the darkness that seemed to be closing in around me. But the lights only seemed to make things worse. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering in the corners of my vision, always just out of sight. Suddenly, the power went out. I was plunged into darkness, with only the sound of the rain and my own labored breathing to keep me company. Panic set in. I scrambled for my phone, fumbling with the flashlight, my mind racing through every scary story I had ever heard. The air grew colder, and I could feel something, someone, standing behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house had locked me in, trapping me with whatever entity was toying with me. I could hear it now, soft whispers, like the sound of someone breathing in my ear. I ran upstairs, barricading myself in the bedroom, praying that the night would end. But the whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. It was no longer just the sound of someone breathing. It was laughter. Cold, malicious laughter that sent chills down my spine. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep, but when I woke up, the rain had stopped. The house was quiet, too quiet. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the room. I gathered my things in a hurry, desperate to leave before nightfall came again. But as I reached the front door, I found it unlocked. It swung open easily, as if nothing had happened. As I walked to my car, I glanced back at the house one last time. That's when I saw it, standing in the upstairs window, watching me. A figure, dark and featureless, its head cocked to one side as if amused by my terror. I quickly got in my car and drove away, not daring to look back. I reported the experience to the Airbnb host, but they brushed it off, saying the house was old and creaky. I never got a refund, but I didn't care about the money. I was just happy to be alive. Whatever was in that house, it didn't want me there. I still have nightmares about that place. The rain sounds, the laughter, the shadow in the window, it's all burned into my memory. Some people might say I imagined it all, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I was not welcome in that house, and I was lucky to escape with my life. This story is about the locked room. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway for some much-needed rest. I had been working non-stop and found a remote Airbnb that promised tranquility, tucked away deep in the mountains. I'd stayed in many Airbnb homes before, and nothing strange had ever happened, until now. This would be my last experience with any Airbnb. The house was charming at first glance, a small wooden cabin with an inviting porch and large windows that looked out onto the dense forest. The perfect escape. I arrived just as the sun was setting and immediately noticed the eerie silence. Not a single bird sang, no wind rustled the trees. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. But I shrugged it off as part of the isolation I had been craving. Inside, the house was cozy. The hosts had left a note on the table, welcoming me and providing the Wi-Fi password, but something about the handwriting made me uneasy. It was shaky, hurried. The note also mentioned something about not opening the door to the back room. "It's locked for a reason," the note read. I thought it was odd, but I didn't pay too much attention to it at the time. As night fell, the rain began. It started with a soft patter, but quickly escalated into a heavy downpour. The sound of the rain tapping against the windows should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It felt wrong, like it was a warning. I settled into bed, trying to distract myself by watching scary stories on YouTube. I was a sucker for ghost stories, even though they always left me feeling uneasy. I watched animated horror stories where shadows moved on their own and houses came alive with sinister forces. The kind of creepy tales that, in the moment, seemed far-fetched, until you found yourself living one. It was sometime after midnight when I first heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the rain. But there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the locked room. A soft, rhythmic knocking, like someone gently tapping on the door from the other side. My heart raced. I sat up in bed, listening, hoping it was just my imagination. But the knocking continued, steady and insistent. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:03 a.m. Perfect. Right in the middle of the night, when every horror story happens. I thought about calling the Airbnb host, but what would I say? There's knocking coming from the room you told me not to open. I could already imagine how that conversation would go. Trying to calm myself, I convinced myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch knocking against the house. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The knocking was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I thought about all the paranormal videos I'd watched, ghost hunting expeditions where people heard unexplained sounds coming from locked doors. But this was real, and I was trapped inside with whatever was making that noise. I told myself to stay calm, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But the knocking wouldn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped altogether. For a moment I felt relief, until the door handle rattled. Something was trying to get out. I stared at the door, frozen in place. The rain was pouring harder now, drowning out all other sounds. I wanted to leave, to run out of the house and never come back, but I couldn't. The rain was so heavy, it would be impossible to drive. Besides, the only way out was past that door. I grabbed my phone and searched for paranormal activity videos, hoping to find some rational explanation, but everything I saw only confirmed what I feared. Something was in that room. I clicked through Reddit threads, reading stories of people who had experienced similar things. True horror stories about locked rooms, about spirits and entities that refused to leave. It was the kind of nightmare I had always dismissed as fiction. Until now. I sat there for hours, waiting for something to happen, but the door remained silent. Just as I started to relax, thinking maybe it was over, I heard it again. A soft, scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. The door handle turned slowly, and I could hear something breathing on the other side. Panic set in. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick, and held it in front of me like a weapon. I had no idea what I was going to do if that door opened, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I backed into the corner of the room, keeping my eyes fixed on the door. Then suddenly, the rain stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment I thought maybe the nightmare was over, but then the door handle jerked violently. The door burst open, and a gust of icy wind swept through the room, blowing out the candles. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. A presence, cold and malevolent, filling the room. I backed up until I hit the wall, my heart racing. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the doorway. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, watching me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my body frozen in place. The shadow stepped closer, and I could hear its breathing, heavy and labored, as if it hadn't taken a breath in centuries. I closed my eyes, praying for it to go away. But when I opened them again, the figure was gone. The door was closed, the rain had returned, and everything was as it had been before, except for the deep scratches now visible on the inside of the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner, waiting for dawn, watching the door. When morning finally came, I didn't waste a second. I packed my bags and fled, never looking back. As I drove away, the rain started again, harder than before. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second I thought I saw the shadow standing in the window, watching me leave. I never told the Airbnb host what happened. I didn't need to. They knew. They had warned me not to open the door, and I hadn't. But something in that house had wanted out, and it wasn't done with me yet. I still have nightmares about that house. The rain, the scratching, the shadow in the doorway. No matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that room is still waiting, still watching, and one day it's going to find me again.